All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yeah. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, General Brito, and also, of course, the command staff and the faithful servants out there who are serving our country. We're so very thankful for your service and your leadership, and it's my honor to be here to celebrate this centennial year, this Centennial Leadership Week, and, of course, particularly Women's Equality Day. I've had the opportunity to be mayor now almost 8 years, and it's been an extraordinary ride. And one of the greatest joys has been being able to work with Fort Benning, the extraordinary line of generals we have had, of course, starting with General Brown, General H.R. McMaster, General Scott Miller, General Eric Wesley, and now, of course, General Gary Brito. So there's something very special about Fort Benning. I don't know why they're sending us the best of the best, but I can tell you as mayor, we certainly appreciate it. And we've had the opportunity to partner on so many things. We've been able to partner to flex our civilian political muscle to help Fort Benning get the resources it needs to be an extraordinary maneuver center of excellence. We've also had the opportunity, of course, to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in what we call our South Columbus area that used to be, frankly, right after World War II, the area that was built up to support the families of Fort Benning after that incredible growth from the major world conflict. And, of course, with the passage of time, grew a little squidgy around the edges. And now, of course, we've got to invest to create the infrastructure that makes people want to move back, makes businesses want to come back here. And so much has been done over these years to lay the foundation for that infrastructure to allow for that growth. And I will tell you, this magnificent structure that we sit in today was a joint project between the community, the philanthropic community, the citizens, of course, and you at Fort Benning. And here we have this incredible homage to your service, to the service of generations that came before you. And it is two communities came together for one incredible, treasured asset. Every time I walk into this building, it has been for some great function that we're having, whether it's a ball, whether it's a great speech, whether it's to preview a movie to come, to programs that encourage inclusivity and diversity, as we'll be speaking a bit about today. But I have two particular memories that will always stick with me and bring a smile to my face. And one involves an 8-year-old little boy who was the son of some parents that were working on my reelection campaign in 2014, and I happened to be here for an event, and he saw me, and he came to me, of course, as an 8-year-old, but speaking as only they can do in the voice of a 35-year-old confident man. And he said, Mayor, he said, I went to summer camp here at the National Infantry Museum, and he said, those veterans were in and out of that place all week long. So if you need help with a veterans vote, you let me know. So I called on him a little later, but I think we did all right with the veterans vote. But also, of course, a joyous memory of my father-in-law, who served in World War II, was a member of the 503rd Paratrooper Infantry Regiment, known as the Rock, which had a hand in liberating Crickador Island in the Pacific. And I was wheeling him as my husband was helping his mother make it through the first 100 yards of this incredible museum. And, of course, as you know, the 503rd is projected on the ceiling there as you come through the World War II exhibit. And so I called out, I said, hey, Tony, there you are. And, of course, if you've seen that particular film, it looks like a bunch of black flecks of pepper up in the sky. You couldn't discern a human soul if you had tried. And he laughed and laughed. He thought that was so funny, and this place brought him such joy and such pride to be able to reminisce. He ended up serving in the military through Korea, of course, and through even Vietnam in his latter years. So it's once again my honor to be here in this great place with you great people, to help share some thoughts on how we might be our better selves through leading people. My object here today is to speak about leading people in the context of Women's Equality Day. But I want to make sure you know that my remarks about women equality are not meant to diminish anyone else's journey. Women don't necessarily have it harder. We have it different, and there are most certainly systemic societal norms that make our journey very difficult. We have, all of us, our own journey, and our own story. You may have been born into economic distress. You may have suffered from any number of other challenges. You may, through your ethnicity, your race, your gender, or your sexual orientation, be a member of another group that is subject to suppression, disrespect, disenfranchise, or bias. And your journey necessarily meant that you had to overcome those things. So we all have our story. As they say, you may see the glory, but you don't know the story. And we need to remember that as we meet people we do not know. And so today we'll endeavor to understand each other's story just a little bit better. American society has set about a deliberate pace for the inclusion and diversity of others in this country. And I use the word deliberate with great purpose. The word deliberate was actually used by the United States Supreme Court in the seminal decision of Brown versus Board of Education, which of course ordered the racial integration of our public school system. And you may know that Thurgood Marshall, who later became a United States Supreme Court Justice himself, as a lawyer, argued that opinion before the United States Supreme Court. So as he sat in the United States Supreme Court hearing Brown versus Board of Education read aloud from the bench, he latched onto what was the critical holding of the case. And it was that the states of the United States were thereby ordered to racially integrate the public school system with, quote, all deliberate speed. And so Thurgood Marshall bounded down the stairs of the Supreme Court. He went to the first payphone and he called his legal assistant and he said, get the Webster's Dictionary off the shelf and read to me, what is the definition of deliberate? And she dutifully did so, and she said, deliberate, meaning slow. With all slow speed, we were to integrate ourselves. And the deliberateness, the use of the word deliberateness, was a result of a desire wanting to get it right, wanting to preserve the stability in our communities while we made this seismic change in how we lived. But the word deliberate has caused much frustration as months and years have turned into many decades of implementation. And largely the armed services have shown this nation how to do it, how to be more inclusive at every level. In 2017, there was a Congressional Research Service report on diversity, inclusion, and equal opportunity in the armed services, and it chronicles the history of the military's efforts to make these various implementations. First, of course, starting with race, it notes that people of color served this nation in a military fashion, starting with the American Revolution. And it was not into the Truman era that actually the DoD ordered the integration of our services. And by 1954, during the Eisenhower administration, it was announced that the armed services had been, quote, fully integrated. And of course, we know that may have been the case on paper, but it took years, it took decades, it took tremendous effort to make that implementation actually occur as a function of our day-to-day lives. And I know because I've had the opportunity to be here, sometimes in this particular facility and sometimes actually on Fort Benning. I've had the opportunity to be at programs where this branch of the armed services is actively seeking to renew and refresh its commitment to full integration. So it is an ever-evolving process, and I commend the Army particularly in their effort to keep that anew. Of course, this report also talks about our struggles as a nation and the struggles of the armed services with incorporating gender orientation in the roles of the military today. And so we continue to applaud the military's awareness of these struggles, and it's once again being called upon to lead our people to the next plane of humanity and equality. And after an initial slow start, the armed services have been in full throttle to integrate women into your ranks. Of course, the first woman general was a woman by the name of Deborah in 1200 BC. She was the commanding general of 10,000 Israelites, as the Old Testament tells us, and she conquered 900 chariots of iron. Some 32 years later, some 3,200 years later, we named the next four-star woman general in Anne Dunaway. So again, we have some deliberate progress integrating women into the armed services. And so we, of course, have seen with World War I and World War II, women serving in a volunteer, administrative, and supportive capacity. And then, of course, in 1967, we lifted the percentage limit on how many women could actually serve in the armed services. In 2013, we lifted the ban on direct ground combat prohibition, and of course, most recently, we began the integration of the esteemed Army Ranger Unit. So indeed, we have made progress, and that is not to be slighted. But the deliberate and methodical process of the inclusion of women in our nation's professions and organizations, including, of course, the armed services, has been a direct reflection of societal norms and biases that go right to the perception of women, of women's ability to perform, of the ability of others to perform in the presence of women. And some of them, frankly, are based on some very dark and troubling superstitions and false narratives. And I will mention just a few because I think as I do, you will see the remnants of some of these items continue today in massed fashion. One, we have demonized women in our hundreds years history for their strengths and talents and self-sufficiency. Need I remind you of the Salem witch trials? Women who were known to be smart, women who were known to exhibit their freedom, their independence, their self-sufficiency, were cast upon by superstitions, sometimes by very skewed and misinterpreted passages of religious scripture, to focus of fear and suspicion, and to keep women subservient and controlled for lest they become a threat. We also, of course, through the years have sexualized women to negate their merit of achievement. Of course, if a woman achieves something, it must have been through her feminine wiles or her mystical allure, because it could not have been of the merit and substantive character of her person. We have institutionalized women for declaring they were feminist, for declaring they were suffragettes, for daring to live independently from abusive spouses. There have been fathers, there have been husbands, there have been sons who literally have institutionalized and sometimes thrown into prison women for mental illness and antisocial behavior, for expressing views that we now consider to be very commonplace in the new social norms. There actually is a hundreds years old doctrine, legal doctrine called femme covert. It's a French doctrine, and of course was carried over with us in the formation of this country from our Western European ancestors. And it basically provides that women are inherently incredible, that they lack the intelligence to understand, to be able to discern the difference between fact and fiction. And so that's why women could never own property, because they couldn't attest to anything on a will. They could not, women were unable to be lawyers, to be doctors, because they couldn't take the oath of office. They didn't know what the truth was. Women in the state of Texas until the mid-1980s could not testify in their own rape trial because they were discerned by statutory law to not have the character or the intellect to be able to discern between fact and fiction. So in Texas, if you had the misfortune and the tragedy to have been raped, your attacker could only have been incarcerated if there was a third-party witness or other such evidence, such as a confession, because remember, there was not a DNA evidence of that sort during that period. So up until the 1980s, we were still, as an institutionalized, state-run legal system, exercising this particular doctrine. And of course, the social shunning of women who step outside of norms to declare their independence. They're deemed socially inappropriate and somewhat undesirable. And it is likely that nary a woman or a man in this room would confess to being a feminist because of the negative connotation that word has and comes with daring to outwardly espouse women's equality. Doing so makes you radical. It makes you a feminazi. It makes you a man-hater. It makes you perhaps questionable in your sexual orientation, when actually feminism is defined as the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. The advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of sexes. And yet, if I were to ask all of the feminists to stand up in this room, which I won't, I don't want to embarrass anybody, that's not my object, but if I was to ask all the feminists to stand up, there would be but a few, I guess. And so I would ask you to contemplate as you go about your business today, would you have stood up? And if not, why? It's something that perhaps we need to think about. I think there's a perception that being a feminist suggests that we want to take another's place. Equality is not about taking somebody else's place. It's about excelling in your own distinct, unique set of circumstances and having access to the same status, the same rights, and the same opportunities as another. And frankly, there's nothing more American. In fact, that truism has been indoctrinated into the Declaration of Independence some 240 years ago, and yet we still struggle with it today. What is equality? The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, and I will remind you the use of men then meant Homo sapiens. It meant humanity. All men are created equal. When will we fully appreciate that and live that as our American creed and our American heritage? I want to speak for a minute about my particular story. If you had asked me some 8 or 10 years ago if I'd ever been the subject of gender discrimination, my answer would have been firmly no. And that was true. I had the privilege of practicing law with some of the finest lawyers in this country. And frankly, lawyers know better. I practiced law with some gentlemen, of course, that were quite a bit older than me. I went into a particular field of law known as complex litigation, and people don't stumble into that out of law school. I think it happened to be my mistake, but that's a whole nother story for another day. But most of the men that I worked with were some 30 years my senior. They were literally old enough to be my father. Many of them had daughters younger than me for the majority of my career in that particular path. And there was no lawyer in my law firm that was younger than 12 to 15 years older than me. So any perceived disrespect or dismissiveness that I experienced, I roundly sloughed off to my youth. Just not being professionally ripe enough to stand up with people of that professional caliber and that professional experience. I had not put in the miles, and certainly the judges who were in their mid-60s were old enough to be my father as well. And so it's hard to discern. I would have not said that that was attributable to my gender. I think it probably was most certainly attributable to my age and my progressing, but at that time unripe experience. But by the time I came to run for mayor of Columbus, Georgia, I was almost 45 years old, for God's sake. So it certainly wasn't because I was too young or too unaccomplished. I had done many things in my professional career and here in this community. And so I remember I had a few people come to me and say, hey, you should consider running for mayor, which was not something I had ever really considered before. And so I went to a local political guru, somebody who had run a lot of campaigns and been very involved in politics in Columbus. And I invited him for coffee at the Burger King on Winton Road. And we were sitting there, and I said, a few people have suggested I run for mayor, and I was just wondering, what do you think about that? And he said, well, if I were you, I wouldn't waste my time doing it. He said, you'll never win. And I said, really? What are your thoughts on that? And he said, well, first of all, white men don't like you. And I was like, really? And he said, yep. He said, white men do not like strong, educated, opinionated women, and a white man will never vote for you. And I said, huh. And he said, and there's just too many white men in Columbus, Georgia, you'll never make it. And I said, well, I appreciate your candor. And so I went home that night. I actually went back to the office, and I was consumed with my work day and frankly didn't think about it much later. I went home. My husband Tripp and I were preparing dinner, as we do most nights that we can. And Tripp said, hey, how did that meeting go? Oh, that guy you were going to ask about running for mayor. I said, well, he said we just need to move on to something else. And he said, well, why? He said, white men don't like me. And there was just this dead pause. And I turned around, and my husband said, well, I like you. And I was like, yeah, my husband does like me. And I was like, and my partners, they like me too. I got neighbors, they like me. I know some people, they like me. So maybe he was just a little wrong, because we won the first time out with 68% of the vote, and the second time out with 63% of the vote. So I carried some white men in there somewhere. But I will tell you, on election night, It was really this incredible night. We had this just ferocious race for mayor. It was an open seat. 4 people had run. It was just really something else. It was a great process, but it was a really intense process. And so that night in our election headquarters, as WTVM announced that I was the projected winner of that evening, people just went nuts. It was just really electric, because you have to remember our prior mayors were not even of the baby boomer generation. Our prior mayors had been of the traditionalist generation, those who fought in World War II or very near to it, or the Korean War. So they were more of the traditionalist, not baby boomer crowd. And so we went from traditionalist era mayors to a Gen X mayor in one night. That's quite a radical transformation of generational perspective, and there was just an electricity about it. And now when I was running, of course, the typical lawyer in me, and perhaps the typical woman trying to always express her merit, I ran on merit. I believe that America is a meritocracy. I believed firmly I was the best, most qualified candidate, and that's all I ever talked about, was that I was the best, most meritorious candidate, the right person for the job at that time. And so on election night, as people were celebrating, actually there were 3 women, well into their 70s, maybe beyond. I didn't know them, don't know them to this day. They didn't leave a name, and I didn't think to get it in all the chaos. But 3 completely separate women at different times in the evening came up to me and told me some story somewhat like this. I poured coffee for 30 years for men less qualified than me so you could run for mayor. I trained men with less education and less IQ to make twice the money I made so that you would have the opportunity to run for mayor. And I was ashamed. I was ashamed. I had had the luxury to ignore the fact that I was going to be the first woman mayor of Columbus, Georgia. I had had the luxury to ignore the fact that the majority of voters in Columbus, Georgia are women. I had had the luxury to run on my merit because of those women, because of the path they cut for me. And I vowed never to forget it. And so when I go into schools, whether they be elementary schools, whether they be high schools, whether I have the opportunity to speak to great folks like you, I make sure that the women in the room know that I'm holding that seat warm for you, and the seats of other leadership positions warm for you. I will endeavor to cut a path for all great leaders, but certainly for those great leaders that happen to be women that want to take advantage of those opportunities, and I stand on the shoulders of those women that came before me. Shortly after I became mayor, as you all may know, the mayor is also public safety director, so I oversee the police department, the fire department, Homeland Security, as well as the Muskogee County Prison, which is the largest work camp in the state of Georgia. And so it's very common that I'll receive phone calls on my cell phone from the chief of police, Rick Boren, who's such a fine man, and I've had such a privilege of working with him. And in any event, he contacted me on this particular day. It was just a regular day. I had no special events planned. In fact, I was just wearing some skirt and some sweater. And certainly nothing special. And he contacts me and says, hey, I didn't want you to be alarmed, but a helicopter is about to land on the government tower. And I said, okay. I said, well, who's coming in a helicopter? And he said, well, it's the governor. He's going to that big event down at the National Infantry Museum. And I said, the governor? And he says, yeah, the governor. And I said, okay. And so I called down to my public information officer. I said, my God, did we miss a call from the governor that he's coming to Columbus, Georgia? Now, let me stop right here and explain something that you may not know if you haven't been in elected leadership or worked in the political environment. The governor, of course, is the head of all what they call agencies and jurisdictions in the state of Georgia. As mayor of Columbus, it's a consolidated government, and so I'm an immediate report, if you will, to the governor. I'm an immediate report. I am the head of the county which the governor oversees. And so in no event, in no interpretation of protocol, should the governor ever be invited to this jurisdiction by anybody other than the mayor. And if the mayor certainly is alive, the mayor should be aware that the governor is coming to the jurisdiction and should be there to receive the governor. So this was a lapse of protocol of incredible proportion, and I assumed it had somehow been my office's mistake. And so with my very worthy and diligent public information officer, we sped about 80 miles an hour down to this place right here, and I get here, and there are hundreds of people here. The Spencer High School Marching Band is here. The Carver Drum Line is here. Everybody is here but the mayor. So I get out of the car, I'm standing, working my way through the Spencer High School Marching Band, trying to get up to the front, and I see some of the, older guard of the city, if you will, and they're huddled around General Bob Brown, who was brand new at that time. And they were explaining to him that the governor was just around the corner and he was coming, and they wanted General Brown to, of course, go out and greet him. And so I heard General Brown say, "Well, where's the mayor?" And I said, "I'm over here, back behind the band." And so he kind of waved me forward. I'd met him one time before, just one time. I'd been in office a couple of weeks, 8 weeks maybe. And so I come up and the older folks said, "Hey, well, look, Mayor, the way this is going to work is the governor's coming to see General Brown. And I'll let y'all in your courses on officer leadership understand the difference between civilian leadership and military leadership. But certainly on civilian land, it would be the mayor in this circumstance that would receive. The governor and General Brown, of course, well knew that. And so we started out towards the governor's motorcade, and General Brown leaned over to me and he said, "I want you, when we get close to that motorcade, I want you to take 2 steps ahead of me, and you're to receive the governor of this state." I said, "Yes, sir." And so if you'll look on the day after, on the front page of the Ledger-Inquirer, there is a picture of me as mayor receiving the governor and General Brown standing there right next to us. And I will be forever indebted to General Brown as a man of magnanimous leadership who showed this community how to follow a woman leader. That is what the military instilled in him. That is what a man of character demonstrates, and that's what he demonstrated to this community on that day. And so there are plenty of days, my having been mayor of the 7.5+ years now, almost 8, that have been like the political guru days. There have been plenty of days, more so, that have been like the General Bob Brown days. And those are the days that I choose to bask in. All in all, I would say that having been a woman in elected leadership has been a challenge in some respects and an asset in others. While it makes it more difficult to command the respect of the traditional power structure, it makes it easier to garner the respect and admiration of those who, because of their own journey, know the strength and character it took to overcome the inertia of tradition. Those folks trust and appreciate you as a leader and will support and defend and follow you because of your unique journey, because of your distinction. So my message to the traditionalist and the power structure inertia specialist is the train of the future is here and it's leaving the station. Get on it or be left behind. That's what diversity and inclusivity requires of us, is to be on the train of the future. And I want to make sure that in my time today that I give a shout out to all the secure and aware and leader men out there who respect and admire and will follow women leaders. I can remember and name every single one of them that stepped out of their way to give me cover against their lesser, struggling male colleagues. And I implore you to be that man. Be that leader. They are giants. They are magnanimous in their ability to set an example and to lead people. Now, except for all this throwing yourself in a war zone and life-threatening circumstances way, you guys got it easy when it comes to leadership. In the civilian world and elected leadership, we have to lead our bosses. Try that. I have to tell you, this business of your rank and of the chain of command is enviable to those of us who are in civilian leadership. There's been many a days I've wanted to court-martial a few folks, but unfortunately haven't had the power to do so. In fact, I used to joke with General Scott Miller that I would have made an excellent general, and I think I would have. He reminded me, however, that there was an age limit to getting into the military, and so he thought I just might be aged out, but We'll see. Anyway, it's been my job as mayor to lead my colleagues on city council, who of course have different but co-equal powers with mine. And it's also been my privilege to lead citizens who placed me in this position and to whom I am accountable. And so it's been a little different than maybe what you all have experienced or will be experiencing as you pursue your careers in the military. But I wanted to leave you with several principles of leadership that this first woman mayor of Columbus, Georgia, has employed in helping to move the city forward. First of all, respect people. Take a moment to contemplate their journey. People are just trying to get by the best way they know how under the circumstances that have been presented. A little bit of humanity, of basic respect, and attempted empathy goes a long way to not only being a better person, but being able to lead all kinds of people. 2, understand that people just want to be heard. The truth of the matter is that when you're a leader, people want you to know them. They really don't care about knowing you. They want you to know them. And that's what's incredibly important. In Columbus, we have this Let's Talk with the Mayor process, and we hold dozens and dozens of community forums, certainly throughout these 8 years, and it's an opportunity for citizens to come forward and tell us of their complaints and their thoughts, absolutely. It's an opportunity for us to share information so as to stop conspiracy theories or misinformation spinning out of control in the community. But the most important thing it is a cathartic exercise of our citizens getting the opportunity to be heard by their leaders. And so don't forget, as a leader, one of your most important roles is to simply listen to and truly hear those that you command. Thirdly, be prepared to follow another leader in their time and place. This is a lot like the process of drafting in a stock car race. If you all have ever seen a stock car race, you get the benefit of someone else's strength, vision, and momentum in that moment. The true test of a leader is whether you can follow or support another when the moment calls for it. If you haven't already, in some sense, you will someday follow a woman. The success of the joint mission, whether it's military or civilian, will depend on your ability to truly respect, execute, and follow. Our biases will defeat us. Our respect for one another will ensure our success. Next, lead like you will never stand for re-election. You know, leading's a lot like being in the batter's box. If you got your eye on the ball, you got a chance of winning. If you got your eye on the stands, the ball's going to smack you right in the face. And so, understand that as a leader, you have to make the best right decision at that time and moment, regardless of the circumstances or the ramifications on your career or whatever it may be. The truth of the matter is, if you make the best right decision for the moment, I find that makes you utterly re-electable, and I bet in your walk of life, it will make you utterly successful in your career trajectory as well. So making the best right decision at that moment, regardless of future circumstances. You just simply cannot poll for the future. You cannot assess how your actions will be judged in the future. And lastly, and most importantly, leadership is about service. It's not about power. That is the single biggest mistake I see made by failed leaders. If you mix it up, you will be lost. You will follow your tail your entire career. Leadership is about service. It truly, truly is. And that's why the respect and the empathy comes in as very valuable. So yes, leading people is exhausting, but when you do it with the objective to treat all people as equals, to respect and lift up those you lead, when we do it always with the objective to demonstrate our better selves, it is exhilarating, rewarding, and well worth the inherent weight of leadership. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you,